This is Louise Zimmer with another story from our pioneer past. We've been spending a lot of time with a young fellow named Joseph Holly Buell, the son of Mary Hurd and David Buell, the second of their 12 children, born in Killingworth, Connecticut on a cold February day in 1760. And 26 years later he was stationed at what many soldiers referred to as the far end of nowhere, Fort Harmar, at the confluence of the Ohio and Muskingum rivers. At that time it was the far west outpost of the frontier. The summer had been long, hot, humid. Now I guess some things never change. And in 1786 the summer days were days of constant threatening by deteriorating relations with local Indian tribesmen. Besides that, the usual hardships of army life in the border country, low morale among troops, ever lower food supplies, accidents, unexpected and alarming weather conditions, which in this location usually involved the rivers. The Ohio had risen 10 feet without warning in the middle of August when it hadn't rained for almost 2 weeks. Those East Coast fellows, including Joe, were flabbergasted. How could this happen? No radio or TV and no jolly weatherman to warn them about downpours upstream. Just, here it comes, get out of the way. And then after a hot and dry September came the autumn rains, more high water. And once again Orderly Sergeant Buell complained that he and his men had been up most of the night hauling boats up to ever higher ground to get them out of the way of the water, which, quite unlike the usually well-behaved ocean they had grown up with, kept going down and then coming up. Joe noted that this going down and then coming up was to him a most astonishing activity. Now, as I've read through his journals, I've come to realize that Joe Buell was one of those fellows who seemed to do well in almost all circumstances. One who was quick to see every opportunity and even quicker to grasp it. And so even the astonishing activity of the rivers had a plus side. A considerable number of boats have come floating down the Ohio, having been swept away in the flood. And then he added, some of them very richly loaded. Well, the astonishing activity of the rivers in the heat of Indian summer stopped abruptly in November as a bone-chilling, wet and windy cold settled over the Ohio Valley. That was the bad news. The good news was that the hunting was much better than it had been all summer. November the 13th, our hunters have brought in 30 deer and a great number of turkeys into the garrison. And then on the 25th he writes, Captain Hart's and Captain McCurdy's companies came in from surveying. They had a cold, tedious time of it. Their clothes were worn out, some without shoes, and their feet badly frozen. They may or may not have known it, but those surveyors had been out making history. Begun in Pennsylvania, it was the first survey of lands by the federal government west of the Ohio River. Their work would be recorded as the 7 ranges and would be offered for sale at $2 an acre in tracts of not less than a section of 640 acres. It was hard and very dangerous work. The Indians were quick to catch on that these fellows peering through their strange-looking apparatuses were up to no good. Native tribesmen had learned the hard way that this activity was usually the first step of a major invasion of white settlers. The pattern was obvious. First the surveyors, then the settlers, men with guns, axes, and plows along with their livestock and families. As far as the Indian was concerned, it only made sense to nip this in the bud, so to speak, pick off that first bunch and save ourselves a lot of trouble. And so it was that the surveyors were a particular target, always traveled with heavy guards, such as the 2 companies of men Joe Buell describes, and to make life even more difficult, they could work best after the leaves were off the trees. Better visibility bought at the price of cold weather. I remember reading a surveyor's journal where he complained that his mustache kept freezing to the metal of his transit. The surveyors and soldiers might have been cold and half frozen, but at least they had plenty to eat. Ensign Kingsbury returned from Fort Pitt with 60 bushels of corn, 20 bushels of potatoes. Snow, described by Joe as considerable, fell on the 20th, and then, oh, this unpredictable Ohio Valley weather. A week later, the snow went off in a warm spell with a heavy rain, and you guessed it, the river came up again. Now you'll remember we spoke of Joe's friend, destined to be both lifelong friend and eventually business partner, Levi Munsell. And maybe you remember that Levi seemed to have a lot of bad luck. Back in midsummer he went hunting, and in Joe's words, he was accosted by a monstrous snake. 12 feet long the thing was, and then a few weeks later he overturned his canoe, Levi did, couldn't swim and almost drowned. And now as this December flood came rushing up into their little settlement, wouldn't you think Levi would have made sure his bed was out of any reach of possible high water, especially since he couldn't swim? Well, apparently not. Joe records December 22nd. This evening we had a heavy storm. Our hut was destroyed along with our supply of spirits and carried off Sergeant Munsell's bunk. You'll notice he lists the loss of his supply of spirits first. Obviously, this was a greater loss than poor Levi's bunk. December 22nd, the river is back in its banks, but there's always trouble of some kind. 5 men of Captain Hart's company were tried by court-martial for stealing a barrel of beef. He doesn't say what punishment was given the offenders, and a few days later he mentions that Christmas is coming. In later years, the Marietta settlers would appear to hardly notice the holiday. Probably their New England Puritan heritage had something to do with that, but the fellows at Fort Harmar were an eclectic bunch, from varied backgrounds and traditions. Christmas was a holiday as far as they were concerned, and its main feature was food and drink. Joe Buell records December 25th, 1786 like this. The sergeants of Hart's and Strong's company dined together at Captain Strong's, and notwithstanding our scarcity of provisions, we had a splendid feast and entertainment, drank about 12 gallons of wine. Since he doesn't tell us how many of his buddies were celebrating with him, we don't know just how big a share each received of all this bounty, but it must have been enough to satisfy Joe. Ever a man to keep an eye on his expense account, he goes on to note with some satisfaction, our reckoning amounted to only 12 shillings apiece. And so the holiday was over, and a new year was upon them. 1787 was on the horizon. Joe Buell and all the fellows there at Fort Harmar were headed for some exciting times to come, there in our pioneer past.